Thank you. Well, it is so awesome to be here this morning. And unlock my iPad would be awesome too. Come on. Tan and I were reminiscing that we actually were in a mom's group together. It seems like just yesterday. All right. Why is this not working? Let's try this again. But it was not just yesterday. There we go. Voila. I love technology, except when it doesn't work, and then I do not like it. Well, it's been quite a year, hasn't it? Whew. And now we're heading into the holidays, pandemic style, right? Oh my goodness. We already had Halloween with little or no trick-or-treating, but that didn't stop parents from videotaping their kids pretending to have eaten their Halloween candy. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's a wide range of reactions, but I picked a couple to share with you this morning. So here's the first one.
Our trick-or-treating buckets. Can we have a trick-or-treating?
Here's your buckets. I ate all your candy. I'm sorry.
You have a you have a cavity now? You have a cavity now?
I ate it all.
Mommy, you have a cavity now?
No.
I'm counting on you, Willie.
Juliana.
That's so good of you. Tomorrow I'm going to eat your stuff. For real. And I'm not going to eat you no goodies. Just Poppy. That's so rude of you.
I was really hungry.
Well, you gotta eat some vegetables, not candy. Go. Now. Go it.
Where do I go?
Go eat some vegetables.
I'm sorry.
Go now.
Oh, I love that little kid. You got a cavity? Yeah. Don't eat your vegetables. There's some truth there. So then there are other reactions. So I've got another video for you here.
So you know how I put you to bed last night?
Uh-huh.
Well, I got really hungry and I ate all of your candy. I'm sorry.
You're just joking. You didn't eat my candy.
I did. I was really hungry.
Well, what is some of them?
I know, but I was really hungry and I didn't have any other food. I'm really sorry.
Well, you should eat something from here.
Aww.
Oh, I'm really sorry.
You need to. Mommy, I'm not mad at you.
Aww.
It's okay.
Aww. What a sweetheart, right? Well, many of us are not born with that sweet spirit. Actually, when it comes to forgiving, right, we kind of want the other person to pay, right? When we've been wrong, we have that natural desire. We want to play that wrong over in our heads. We're reliving it, and we want payback on that. We want justice, an eye for an eye. It's kind of our way we're wired. When we've been wronged, we want to get somebody back. But human justice doesn't satisfy. Maybe you've experienced that yourself. We need to let go, and we need to forgive for our own benefit. Now, a discussion on forgiveness can bring up a lot of old hurts. It can be kind of painful and hard to talk about. It can even feel kind of heavy to talk about it, but it's so important because in order to move forward, we have to forgive. We forgive for our own benefit. And I hope to show you that today. Starting right out of the gate with point 1 on your outline, which is realize we forgive for ourselves. Realize we forgive for ourselves. And that's kind of counterintuitive, right? We have that backwards. Sometimes we feel like we forgive based on how worthy the other person is of our forgiveness. How much they begged, how long they suffered, have they pleaded, and then maybe we'll think, okay, I guess they're worthy of being forgiven, right? Because we want to settle the score. We want to right the wrongs. We want to make that other person pay. That saying is, right, revenge is sweet. But interestingly enough, studies show that it's not. It's an interesting paradox that people who sought revenge initially felt better, but actually felt worse long term because they were obsessing about that wrong and making it bigger than it was. And by not retaliating, we're actually helping ourselves get over the hurt. Well, you might think, oh, that revenge, that's extreme. I would never do that. Well, what about harboring bitterness? We could be debt collectors, right? Especially with our husbands. We can start keeping track of all the offenses and letting them pile up. And then we're not going to forgive until we get a payment that we think equals this pile of debts that we've collected. We can be debt collectors when we're harboring that bitterness. It can eat away at us with what the author Nancy DeMoss calls the sharp teeth of bitterness. I love that expression, the sharp teeth of bitterness. And she describes it like this. Maybe you remember that great character in the Charles Dickens novel, Great Expectations. It's an eccentric old woman named Miss Havisham. And we meet Miss Havisham on the day, it's her birthday, but this day, many years ago, her fiancé ran off with another woman. She was dressed and waiting for him, and he didn't show. And the word came to her that he wasn't going to show up, that he had run off with another woman. And it happened at 20 to 9. So she stopped all the clocks at that very time and basically stopped her life. She hung dark drapes over all the windows to block out the light. And she lived in seclusion with her adopted daughter while the wedding cake and the wedding feast lay rotting on the table with the spiders carrying it off and the mice scurrying around. And maybe most vividly, maybe you remember this from watching a movie or a TV series on this, she's in her wedding gown. Right, the gown that she wore on that very day, and now it's all faded and yellow. The veil is in tatters, the lace is torn, holes on it. And when the main character, Pip, comes to the house, he sees this scene and he's astonished by it. And this is what Miss Havisham says to him. On this day of the year, long before you were born, this heap of decay, she points to her wedding gown, right, was bought here. And it and I have worn away together. The mice have gnawed at it, and sharper teeth than teeth of mice have gnawed at me. Oh, I love that expression, right? Sharper teeth than teeth of mice have gnawed at me. And that's what unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment is, right? It's the sharp teeth that are gnawing away at us, tearing deeper than even flesh wounds can possibly do. Bitterness and unforgiveness, it rots us from the inside. The saying is that bitterness or unforgiveness, it's like eating rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. Even when you think about the word holding a grudge, right? It has a heaviness to it, a weight to it, because we are living in a way that is contrary to what God would have us do when we are unforgiving. Right? We need to forgive because it benefits both the forgiver, but also the person that's being forgiven. And sometimes we have that backwards. We think it only benefits the person being forgiven, but that's not true. It benefits the forgiver even more. So we can be either debt collectors and give into our bitterness, or we can choose to forgive. I have to acknowledge that on a teaching about forgiveness, there are women here that have probably been wronged in some very hard and painful ways. Marital infidelity, a husband who's distant and remote, a close friend who betrays you, parents that have hurt you. I don't minimize those and the difficulty it is to move forward. But yet, those old wounds, and they can be so painful to touch, right? Even if it's maybe in the not too distant past, super painful, or an old wound that keeps getting reopened. It can be very hard to go there, but it's so important. Healing comes from forgiveness. It's a healing balm to those tender areas. We can feel like refusing to forgive gives us power over the other person. But it's wrong. Right? It keeps us enslaved to anger and to hurt. Life is full of hurt, right? It's going to happen to everyone. We need to choose to forgive. Forgiveness isn't weak. It's actually a sign of strength. It doesn't mean that we condone what's happened to us, but it means that we choose to release the hurt and move forward. And if that's not enough, forgiveness actually has been proven to have health benefits. In a fitness journal, it was written that studies show that people who have forgiveness or forgiving hearts tend to have better relationships, less general illnesses, and even less serious complications like depression, heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Forgiveness from a human perspective can be based on how worthy we think the other person is of forgiveness, right? Or wanting to seek repayment and how much have they suffered. But ultimately, it's God that judges the rights and the wrongs. He's a just God. And maybe you've heard that phrase before, which means he is morally right and perfectly fair. Right? He will judge consistently and fairly. The scriptures tell us that God loves justice. He's a just God, but he's also a forgiving God. And he's ultimately our role model for forgiveness. Maybe one of the first Bible passages you ever heard is the Lord's Prayer. Matthew chapter 6, verse 12, it says, "Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors." Right? There's a link between God's forgiveness and our forgiveness of others. Right? We want God to forgive us. We must forgive others. The author and preacher Charles Spurgeon wrote, "To be forgiven is such sweetness that honey is tasteless in comparison with it. But yet there is one thing sweeter still, and that is to forgive." It is so sweet to be forgiven. It's like honey, right? But yet even sweeter to forgive. So we need to grant forgiveness to others and seek forgiveness ourselves. So that's point 2 on your outline, is freely seek and grant forgiveness. Freely seek and grant forgiveness. Are you tracking with me on this all? Good. So we've got some blanks to fill in underneath this, so I'll give those to you in a minute. But when we think about forgiveness, it really spans the gamut between the daily bumps and bruises of life to some very deep hurts. So there are minor things that happen that, maybe we can just let go and forgive and not make a big deal about it. But then there are other hurts that can take a lot of work to get to the point where we're ready to forgive. We need to process those deep hurts with the help of maybe a pastor or a counselor or your table leader. But when you think through, how do I go about asking for and extending forgiveness? There is no formula. There's no set way, but let's look at some areas. Starting with when you have wronged somebody. When you've wronged somebody, there's 4 areas that you want to consider. But first off, when you've wronged somebody, you want to go to that person and ask for forgiveness in person if you can. Asking for forgiveness via text is a very, very low priority item, right? You want to do it in person if you can, over the phone if you have to, via text, very much a third and last option. And when you go to that person, right, pray first. It can be scary, right? It can be humbling. Pray that God will give you the words, that'll give you the self-control, will give you the humility to seek forgiveness. And then when you make your apology, think about these 4 areas. First, engage the mind, right? Engage the mind. You need to say, what I did was wrong. You want to be specific, not just like a blanket, I'm sorry, and just kind of try and sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. Right? You want to say, I'm sorry that, and be specific. I'm sorry that I lost my temper. So here's a scenario. A friend wants you to go out with her over the weekend. She calls, she has an idea, and instead of saying no, because you don't really want to go, you say, I'm away this weekend. And then you're shopping in the market and you run into her. Oops, not good, right? And your friend's mad, as she should be, right? You were being dishonest, she's hurt. It's a breach of trust, there's a rift in your friendship. So what are you going to do? You go to your friend and you say, I'm sorry that I lied, right? Call it like it is, right? No excuses. I'm sorry that I lied when I said I was going away this weekend. So you're engaging the mind. Our next point is engage the emotion. You want to say how this impacted the other person. Show that you understand, right? And express regret for what you did. So in our scenario, maybe you say, I realize that what I did was a breach of your trust in me as a friend. And I feel really bad that I damaged our friendship. So you're expressing regret and you're showing how this impacted your friend. Engage the emotion. Number 3 is engage the will. This is where you say, I won't do it again, right? How can I make this up to you? Try to repair any damage that's been done. So in our scenario, you say, I won't do that again, and I'll always tell you honestly when I don't want to do something. So again, you're showing that you understand where things went wrong and that you're going to try and do better the next time. And then lastly, ask for forgiveness. Will you forgive me? It's not easy, right? It takes humility. And it's not a cookbook recipe here, a quarter cup of this, a half a cup of that. But these are just areas to think about when you're making an apology. Now, what if your friend says no? Well, if you're seeking reconciliation, right, if you want to reestablish the relationship, then keep trying. Keep open. Don't harden your heart. But it only takes one person to forgive. It takes 2 to reconcile. And ultimately, what we need to do when we've wronged somebody is we need to also seek forgiveness from God. Because when we go against God's plan, God's rules, that's offense against God as well as the other person. So we need to pray and confess what we've done and ask God to forgive us. Right? Lying is an offense against God because God values honesty, right? God is truth. So when we lie, it's an offense to God, and we need to say, I'm sorry to God. When we want to be forgiven by God, we need to forgive others. So we need to keep that always in mind. So now, what if someone has wronged us? How do we extend or grant forgiveness? That's number B, subpoint B, when you have been wronged. So let's look at that for a minute and talk about some common misperceptions about granting forgiveness. The first is, well, what if the person isn't seeking forgiveness, isn't asking for forgiveness? I've been wronged, but the other person either doesn't even realize it or doesn't care or isn't interested in my forgiveness. Do I need to forgive them? Well, the answer is yes. Right? We saw in point 1, right? Forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for yourself. But we need to make clear that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. We talked a little bit about this, right? Reconciliation is reestablishing the relationship. It takes 2 people to reconcile, but it only takes 1 person to forgive. And sometimes reconciliation, it's not called for. It's not appropriate. Right? If a friend, a very close friend has betrayed you, you might forgive her, but maybe it's not appropriate to become best friends again. So there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. But as we saw before, even if somebody's not asking for forgiveness, we forgive for our own benefits. Second question people often ask is, if I forgive, does it mean I have to forget? Right? I had a woman ask me this very question. She was struggling. Her husband had been unfaithful. She wanted to forgive him, but she said, I just can't forget. What do I do? The answer is, we're human. Of course we can't forget. We can't just erase those files, delete that part of our brain, can't take those, images off our phones as if that's the way we work. But what we can do is choose not to bring it up. Right? Forgiving doesn't necessarily mean we forget, but we choose not to bring it up. We don't keep a record of wrongs. Forgiveness is a choice. It's a process. It's not a feeling. And we can choose to forgive. So let's look at 4 areas for how we can grant forgiveness to others. Starting with identify your emotions. Right? When you've been wronged, there's a mass of emotions you're feeling, right? Maybe you're hurt. You feel disrespected. You feel betrayed. It's a breach of trust. Spend some time thinking through those emotions. Don't dwell on them. Don't obsess about them, but identify it. Don't just sweep it under the rug. Maybe it helps to journal or to write things down. And then make the decision to forgive. You've identified the hurt, but you're not going to just stand there and stay stuck there. You're going to want to move on and make the decision to forgive. You're not saying that what happened is okay, but you're just saying, I'm going to make the choice not to be ruled by what happened, to not let that define my life, to ruin my life. You need to silence that critical inner voice that once you've been hurt says, you were wronged, you'll never be back to your old self, you're ruined, you're damaged, you'll never be free of the pain, you're not strong enough, this can't be fixed. We need to silence that and replace it with a voice that says, you're not a victim, you can move forward, you can choose to move forward, you can choose to forgive. Make the decision to forgive, and then, number 3, work on forgiving. Work on forgiving. It's a process. You make the decision, you choose to forgive, but it doesn't happen all at once. It's not like flipping a switch. But you need to start moving in that direction, even if it's just praying that you want to forgive somebody. Work on forgiving. And then finally, release yourself from emotional prison. Release yourself from emotional prison. Break free from that hurt. We need to rewrite our stories as we move to forgiveness. Right? We don't want to lie. We don't want to minimize the pain, but we don't want to stay there in that place. We want to change our story from a victim story to a hero story. Construct a story that reflects the way we want our life to move forward, not linger in the past. Max Lucado, a great author and preacher, wrote that forgiveness is unlocking the door to set someone free and realizing you were the prisoner. I love that, right? We feel sometimes that we're keeping the other person in prison by not forgiving them, but yet we're the prisoner, right? And when we forgive, we unlock the door, and paradoxically, we walk free. And we need to remember that God is ultimately the judge, right? He will judge and make right, for he is just. He will right every wrong and hold people accountable, ourselves included. Human justice is limited, but God's justice is perfect because he is a fair and a just God. So who do you need to get right with? Maybe someone popped up in your head the minute you heard this topic. You're like, oh, I know, I've been harboring that resentment. Or maybe you need to spend some time in prayer asking God to examine your heart. If you think, oh, I don't have a problem with forgiveness, I'm good with that, don't be so quick. Spend some time to see if there are some root of bitterness in your heart. Because unforgiveness in our heart, it can eat away at us. And it can be a terrible example to our kids. Right? Don't think that they don't notice or they're not watching. We need to be intentional about teaching our kids to be forgiving people. So point 3 on your outline is teach your kids to be forgiving people. Teach your kids to be forgiving people. And how do we do that? Well, we want to teach them to give a complete apology, right? Like we saw above. You just don't want to have that, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Teach them to be specific. I'm sorry that. You can maybe use a modified version of the template we looked up at point 2. Then secondly, teach your other child to say, I'm sorry. I forgive you, right? That's a great exchange of I'm sorry and I forgive you. As I said, I have 2 kids, so there was always, seems like somebody was on the wrong side of the situation. Somebody was annoying the other, beating up on the other one, annoying the other one, hurting the other one. So we had a lot of I'm sorry, I forgive you going back and forth in my house. But it's a great way to give and extend forgiveness, to show the grace that God shows us. And then secondly, ask for forgiveness from your kids when you transgress them, when you do something wrong. What a great model that is. It takes humility to do that. And especially as your kids get older, it doesn't get easier. I remember a time when my kids were young and I lost my temper. I know, shocking, right? Unbelievable. It was a particular time, I like to say I have a very long fuse, I have a very big bomb at the end of that fuse, right? And it was one time when the kids wanted to do something, and instead of saying no, which I said, we'll see, right? And bad, don't do that, say no. I said, we'll see. And then they started nagging. Finally, I was like, I said no. And they were like, oh, what just happened? Who took over my mom? I call it the monster mom. The reaction is way bigger than, what the infraction is. So, it was wrong. I was clearly wrong. Took a couple minutes, gathered myself, went back to my kids, and I said, I'm sorry. I lost my temper. I spoke harshly. I didn't add like you drove me to it. You were nagging me. I couldn't help myself. No, I just owned it. I said, I'm sorry. That wasn't right. Will you forgive me? And it was great. It's a great way to demonstrate to your kids truly that, we all mess up. We all need forgiveness. And it's a great way to teach your kids how to be forgiving people. And then lastly, and most importantly, is we need to teach our kids about God and God as a just and forgiving God. Oops, sorry, clicked on that too fast. Right? God is the one that will judge and will settle the scores. We don't always have to do that ourselves. Right? God will right the wrongs, and that's such an important thing. Now, we can think that there are some things as moms that would be hard, if not impossible, to forgive, like the murder of a child. Well, Mary Johnson felt that way. In 1993, she lost her son after a then teenaged Oshia Israel ran into him at a party. They didn't know each other, but they got into an altercation. Oshia pulled out a gun and shot him and killed him. And Mary said that after that, the root of bitterness set in and she hated everyone. It took over her life. After 12 years of living with this, she had so many unanswered questions that she went to the jail to meet with Oshia Israel. And in that meeting, it was so cathartic, it was so healing. She talked about her son. And Israel cried and apologized and acknowledged what he'd done. In the end, he asked for a hug. And she gave it to him. And she walked out of that jail when he returned to his cell, and she reflected in awe about what happened. And she said, I just hugged the man that murdered my son, and I instantly knew that all the anger and animosity, all the stuff I had in my heart for 12 years was over. Israel was released from prison in 2010. He had grown very close to the mother of the man he killed. Close emotionally and close physically. He moved next door. Unbelievable. Right? Johnson describes him as her spiritual son. Says she looks forward to seeing him get married, graduate from college, things that her biological son will never get to do. When Johnson got married, Israel actually walked her down the aisle. Unbelievable. And Israel describes their relationship now as that really of a mother and a son. They bump into each other in and around the house, and she says things like, how come you haven't come by to see me lately? Or how come you haven't taken out my trash? He said, I find those things funny because this is a relationship with a mother for real. And here is a picture of Israel and Mary Johnson the day he walked her down the aisle when she got married. Unbelievable. How could she do that? You might think she is Superwoman. Well, there's a lot of information out on the internet. Google Mary Johnson forgiveness. You can find so much more about her story and videos. But Mary Johnson is a strong Christian, a woman who knew that if she wanted to be forgiven by God, she had to forgive as well. When asked how she could forgive the killer of her son, she said, "Forgiveness was the only way to get my life back." Forgiveness isn't forgetting. People need to learn that forgiveness is for them, not the person that hurt them. Mary Johnson experienced firsthand the power of a forgiving heart and how it benefits the forgiver. So I hope this encourages you to seek and grant forgiveness where it's needed in your life and to teach your kids to do the same. So thanks for listening today, and I hope you have great discussions at your groups.